Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Bible class. We're in our last week of studies. We have this morning and we have Wednesday, Lord willing. And so excited to wrap this up. In some ways, I'm excited to wrap it up. In other ways, I want to just keep going. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of really interesting things to talk about and discuss with this. And honestly, I think there's some conversations that we should probably continue to have over the course of the rest of our lives, and continue with that. But before we begin, Don Alexander, would you care to lead us in a prayer?
Holy, righteous God, Father in heaven, we're so grateful to you that you blessed us and given us this first day of the week that we have the opportunity to come out and settle together with your children. We may be able to learn more of your will, more of your word, and more about you, and we can draw closer to you in your service. We're thankful for this time that we have together. We pray, be with Jason, help him as he leads us through this study, that we can gain the most from it, that will help us as we try to teach others out around us. Rest thy will in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. So we have just a little bit left over in lesson 13 that I want to make sure that we look at and talk about. And then at that point, there's a couple things that I'd like to do before our time together this quarter is over. Coming back to this list and looking at some of it, there have been some additions. And so we'd like to talk about that a little bit. I don't know how much we'll get into that, but we'll try to do as much as we can. And also, at some point, I would like to give just a bird's eye view of everything that happened from about 33 AD up until 2024. So we have a little bit of time that's passed in between then, but we'll hit some of the highlights of all the lessons that we've talked about and just talk about, just in general, how did we get to where we are right now, and how do we make sure that we don't make the same mistakes that people have made so many times in the past. And so that'll be something that we discuss as well. All right, back into lesson 13. We are looking, again, still at the Restoration Movement and some of the divisions that came about in the group that we call the Disciples of Christ. Now, there was one point where the Disciples of Christ was the fourth largest group of Christians in the United States. It's been a while since that was the case, about 200 years. But that was the thing at one point. But as with most things, there were some divisions that popped up. And one major division that we have already talked about, and that we ended last class on, was instrumental music. And that caused a huge division. And that is where we get the origins of the Christian church and what we consider modern churches of Christ. And that's where that division took place. There were also divisions as far as the American Christian Missionary Society that Alexander Campbell started to try to get off the ground. Remember, there was this whole debate about whether or not we should organize ourselves in that way. He requested that each church would send a delegate to Cincinnati, and they would have this huge overall conference, so that way they could get organized in taking the gospel to different people in different places. So that was a whole thing as well. Now, we're going to shift gears just a little bit more as we look at what is next. There's a computer there. And the next part is talking about premillennialism. I have to say that word very slowly because if I try to rush it, it doesn't work. Well, actually, before we do that, anything else that comes to mind or that you wanted to say or you want to talk about with the American Christian Missionary Society and or the instrumental music debate?
It was not clear in the reading, and I did not research at all. I will admit that.
Cool.
But did the organization itself make decisions for the individual churches, or was this just a way of trying to get missionaries out there?
The Missionary Society?
Yes.
Well, obviously, that's what you're talking about. Yeah. I think at first, no. But, I don't know. I didn't research enough to know for sure. But what was said in some other things that I read was that the main argument against that at first was the slippery slope thing. Just that, if we come together and are talking about it like this, where do we draw the line? Where do we stop? Or will we ever get to the point where, like, this group is making decisions that, here's what we as a brotherhood or a group of churches should teach and believe? I think eventually it did get into some of that squishy territory of trying to decide what we believe and making those decisions instead of an autonomous type thing. So I think it eventually did get to that point. I don't know that it started out like that. And so, like, at first it was more, there were a lot of questions about, okay, well, we don't see authority for this, but I don't know that we are telling each group this is what you do, but I think eventually it did get to that point. And again, I didn't research it enough to know exactly what the details of that look like. That was just someone else's perspective of what happened with that. So, good question. And that's the kind of thing that we need to talk about with this, right? So instead of automatically saying, "Ooh, that sounds off," like that's probably not right. But think about it and go through it and analyze. Okay, is this scriptural? Is this something that is that we would say, well, the Bible doesn't teach this at all, and so have to reason through that. So good follow up. Definitely. Anything else?
Back in lesson 10, it talked about the Republican Methodists. And it said in 1801 they began to call themselves the Christian Church.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I never heard that, or I'm still trying to figure that out.
So yeah, that group there, that version of the Christian Church, and I think throughout history there have been people who have claimed that name as the Christian Church. But that specific one, the Republican Methodist, became the Christian Church, eventually merged with some other groups, and I can't remember who they were, but in the, I think, early 1900s, and that's what became the United Church of Christ. And so if you've ever heard of what the United Church of Christ and some of the things that they stand for, it's a very politically left-centered, not centered because it's left, but it's very much so progressive. I guess we could call it progressive in what they accept and what they teach. And so, I think that's where that group ended up eventually.
I think very social minded.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And so, it's interesting to trace the lineage and where all this comes from, because the modern day Christian church isn't from that. It's more so the division from the disciples of Christ, which came from the Stone Campbell movement and eventually splintered because of instrumental music specifically. But that group became the United Church of Christ, which don't get that group confused with the churches of Christ in general, because that's very, very different. Although there is I saw some things there are certain Christian churches who are leaning more towards some of the more accepting, progressive, women in leadership, some of the LGBTQ rights, those sorts of things. And so, like, you've got some of those groups who are leaning that way, especially in some of the major cities, California. California's not a city, I realize that. But some of the major cities in California specifically.
So I think some of the first Christian churches currently are more of the split ones.
Yeah.
Because
probably.
the one over by Northern Middle, off of 39, that one is a Disciples of Christ.
Okay.
Because the previous preacher, his wife was like, "Oh yeah, we're like cousins or something," and so she knew the lineage and knew that we were closely related.
Right.
And so I think some of those, there's like a symbol they have that signifies that they were part of that movement. And instead of just breaking off as a Christian church. And some of the Christian churches are breakoffs of Baptist Church.
Okay, yeah. And there's a lot of people that are in one group start seeing some maybe inconsistencies with Scripture and whatever, and they start making their breaks. I mean, we talked about some of the people who, James O'Keefe maybe, the guy who was part of the Methodist Church and then broke off, and I think that's actually where the Republican Methodists came in. But you have people from different religious backgrounds who have broken off and started some sort of independent movement or something like that. And that's kind of the basis for what we're looking at with the Restoration movement and what it takes to get back to, what the New Testament says as far as our structure, organization, and those sorts of things. So it's hard to keep track of everything, honestly, and to know, where each group came from and the beliefs and background. And part of that, I think, doesn't matter a lot, but part of that, I think, matters a lot. So it just depends on how you look at it and what your purpose is. I think ultimately you need to talk to people and see where they are then, right now, see their beliefs. Because again, just because someone is part of a particular group doesn't mean that they're going to believe and accept everything from that group either.
Just because a church has a particular name doesn't mean that they actually ascribe to all of the beliefs. Because
It's true.
while they might be part of an organization, or we think they're part of an organization based on their name, maybe they have not. I was talking to one of Kaysen's basketball players' moms, and she was like, yeah, it's a Baptist church, but I don't know why we're a Baptist church, because we don't actually believe that.
Yeah.
And so, they're looking at changing names, but currently they're still labeled as that.
Yeah. That is interesting. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff like that that keep in mind when you're talking to people. Just because the background of where a lot of these splits occurred and all that doesn't mean that they do, and it doesn't mean that they're on board with those things too. So
I think that's why you're seeing a lot of churches drop the whatever Baptist church. It's just now just the
Creed.
Creek.
Yeah.
Don't call anybody out.
Right, no, and you've got some of those names that are just, and sort of this shift into a community church or trying to drop some of the denominational ideas, which actually, I think, it's pretty good, right? We're trying to separate ourselves from that, and so when we talk to people who are in that mindset, that's something to talk about. It's you're right. Trying to drop the names of all of the denominations and everything, and trying to get back to just being called Christians, because you do have a big push for places that are just sort of ambiguous names: the creek, the hill, the I don't know, valley. I'm sure there's one somewhere. But so and this actually is one of the things that I forgot to mention when we were talking about this. As far as the way that people are trying to reach people, I'm not going to say all of them. I can't say all of them because it's not true. But there are some groups that are pushing for some social programs, or the outreach is more centered on, I guess we could call it seeker-friendly things, and it's trying to appeal to people and bring people in to worship that probably wouldn't otherwise, bringing in people with different sorts of programs or food services or childcare, whatever, and replacing the gospel with other things. And so that's a movement, and that's not particularly new either. It's something that people for a long time think about how in history when the Catholic Church was trying to spread out in other areas, and you had these, you could call them conquests, but you have this pagan group has these beliefs, viewpoints, and if you go in and say, it's not very much different from what you're doing, let's just call those Christian things. It appeals to people where they are. And I mean, taking a step back, the gospel does appeal to people where they are, but what is the anticipation of the gospel? So it appeals to you where you are, but is that the end of the story? Yeah, there you go. So yeah, we reach people where they are, but then we help them to see Christ and what they need to do. Okay, so all of that said, I think it's important to see something. Yeah.
I'm gonna throw you off a rabbit hole.
Doesn't take much.
So traveling in Iowa
Yeah.
last weekend, all the different churches and different names, and just, this class has really helped me to understand, because one of the basketball teams that my daughter's team played against was a team y'all never heard of called Dort, D-O-R-D-T, but a big school close to Sioux City, Iowa,
Yeah.
and they label themselves as Reformed Christians. That's, their school is a Christian school, but it's called a Reformed Christian school.
Right.
And I thought that was really interesting, just, based on what we've talked about Reformation, and just, this.
Yeah.
And that's, they say they're affiliated with Reformed Christians, which I've never heard of that.
Yeah. No, I hadn't either. And that's just interesting because now hopefully with the background in the class, you can understand, okay, Reform, probably more so John Calvin, I
Yeah,
guess.
and they follow the practice of Calvin.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So now we have some like vocabulary, that we could like understand, connect some dots. I like that. Yeah.
Some of the churches of Christ are even dropping their names because of, I guess, assumptions people make.
Right.
And so like Christians, like in Brooklyn, or Christians in Bowling Green, or like even the church I grew up in, I think has changed their names to like Christians Meet Here or something, and
Yeah.
taken down like the Church of Christ sign. And I had mentioned that to your aunt, actually. And she was like, well, why would you even want to take down the name, And like, I'm like, well, because we have people assuming certain things about our beliefs that we don't want them assuming. And while that makes it hard when you're traveling to find somebody with similar
It's hard.
beliefs,
Yeah.
it does make us, it opens our eyes to think about, like, yeah, but, like, we have several friends who've started
Yeah.
churches that are not Church of Christ, because where they're at, that name gives a bad taste in people's mouths.
Right. Yeah. Because of bad rap, because of the way people have handled things in the past, or whatever. I can see that. Saying Christians Meet Here, or the church at Brooklyn, whatever. I guess we can get into this a little bit. Is Church of Christ the only biblical name for a group of Christians? No, there's actually a few in the Bible. Now, the reason why a lot of people want to push to use that name is because of the association for people who use some of the other names in the Bible. Meredith requested this like 5 weeks ago, and we'll talk about it now. So why not? The Church of God, like that is a name that is in the Bible, right? But if you visit a church with the name Church of God on the sign, you're probably going to experience something way different than what you would expect. And part of this comes from the origin story, if you will, came from John Wesley. And John Wesley, John Wesley and the Methodist venture. Now, one part of, I don't know that we discussed this, but one part of at least certain branches of the Methodist Church hold to this idea of perfect observance of the law, of like Christ's law for us. Just really sinless perfection as a Christian. Once you are a Christian, God will empower you to be completely free from sin. And you as a Christian will never sin again. And that's the thing. And that turned into a little bit more, and some people were on board with that, some people weren't. That turned into the holiness movement, which the holiness movement was exactly that, saying once you are a Christian, you are sanctified, you are holy, you will never sin again. And that holiness movement actually went into, became Pentecostalism. You have some that are separate from that still, but this was more so, and I think you would get like charismatic, some of those words when it comes to the Pentecostal movement. because of the way they look at spiritual gifts. And if you use the word baptism with someone who is in that movement, what are they probably going to think of? Okay, yeah, Holy Spirit baptism. And they'll go to passages that talk about that, and that's their focus when it comes to the baptism part. Okay, so you have this group, and it was from this group that I think it was in the early 1900s where all of this was happening, and you have the Church of God that came out of that. Now, you do have different branches of the Church of God, even. You have the Church of God of prophecy, and those sorts of things. But typically, Church of God will be more so, we would call it charismatic, very closely related to Pentecostal. And that's really all I know about that. Anybody have anything to add to that or disagree?
I had a friend that I taught with at Burnside, and she was Church of God, but she was I don't know, not all of them believe this, but where she attended, they believed in baptism to be saved. The immersion of baptism.
Yeah.
And I found that, I had never heard that. I found that very interesting, because I always thought, because growing up, my uncle and aunt were Church of God, and they did not believe baptism to be saved. So I thought that, they're all different. But she was very charismatic about everything else in worship.
Right.
But that part I found that they followed the steps.
Right. And we have to talk to people and figure out where they are, because just because they have a certain name doesn't mean that they agree with and believe everything that you think that they do.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's another example of that. And so the thing is with the names, wearing a certain name on a church building or whatever automatically makes us assume some things about somebody. And I think it's only fair to say people will assume certain things about us if we're wearing a certain name. So especially if you're going to an area that just former people in the church or whatever has left a bad taste in the mouth of people, or just not been the kind of Christians that they should, because I think we all understand that even in what we would say the Church of Christ, we have people. Not everybody handles things the way that they should. And people can be a little more abrasive and more forceful with things than they probably should be. And because of that, that can turn some people off the gospel. And so if you're going into a new place and you want to use the name or just put a sign up that says Christians meet here, or the church at Somerset, I don't know, just whatever. That's I would say perfectly fine. I think that is biblical. It is hard, as Meredith said, to find groups if you're traveling and that sort of thing. And that is the confusing part. Well, how do you do that? I don't know. I'm not sure. A lot of places have websites. Check out websites. Usually there's a list of here's what we believe, and you don't have to have a website, but that's something that you can do. Or talk to people who have traveled in that area, whatever. So there's that. But just all of that to say, just be cautious about the use of names. Now, is it important? This completely, other side of this devil's advocate. Is it important to use a name that is biblical?
Yes.
Yeah, 100%. Because if you're using a name that is obviously not biblical, and there's a lot of connotations, names matter, and the things that we call things matter. Is it a big deal if we use the word pastor to talk about someone who doesn't fulfill those qualities in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus? I think that we need to be careful with the way that we use words, because the way we use words change the way we look at things. And so I think it's really important that we use it, and we've heard this before, but talk about Bible things using Bible names. That's important. And sometimes the way that, especially groups that we would consider, we're really getting into it, aren't we? Who we would consider cults. the vocabulary that is used might be very similar to the words we would say, but they mean different things. And this applies, you see it in Mormonism, you see it in the Jehovah's Witnesses. There's a lot of things that look like Christianity, but then when you really investigate and see what is really taught, it's like, whew, that is not at all what even most mainstream Christians would say. So it's important that we use the right vocab and use it the right way, because it does change our perspective. And side note, when someone is coming out of a religion like that, and you're trying to teach them, it's really hard to unlearn all of those things, and it's like there's a lot. Honestly, I don't remember what the figure is, but I've heard that people, specifically coming out of the Jehovah's Witnesses organization, most people who come out of Jehovah's Witnesses actually become atheists, because it's just like there's so much confusion, and there's just so much, man, I don't even know what to do with this, and it just leaves such a bad taste in their mouth that they're like, well, how can we know what's true? Probably none of it, and that's what a lot of people do. And so, like, for us, this is just a little bit of encouragement. If we are in that situation, we're helping someone out of those religions, instead of being like, boom, you're wrong, be more like, listen, I know you've been misled, and I know the wool's been pulled over your eyes. Let's walk through this, and let me help you, like, unravel all of this. It's going to be messy, it's going to take a long time, but that's the kind of attitude we need to have when we're helping in those situations. Okay, yeah, that really took a turn. Any other thoughts, comments on any of those things? Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I was sick Wednesday night, so I don't know if you even talked about the musical instruments.
Yeah,
My dad
so.
did a really in-depth study and presented it when we were at Lakeside, when he was an elder there. The way he brought it, he did an in-depth study of the Old Testament, where you had to be from the tribe of Levi.
Right.
And a lot of verses are in 2 Chronicles, like 29:25 and 7:6, talking about they were brought, King Hezekiah had them to do the musical instruments, the playing of the different instruments. And so, do we know what tribe we're from? And that's how he brought it. But there's a lot more verses that and I used to keep it in my Bible, but I could have scouted off all the verses. But anyway,
Yeah.
he found that in the Old Testament, as an example, they were from the tribe of Levi that did the worship.
Right.
And they played the musical instruments. That tribe, that was their job.
Yeah.
And in the New Testament, we don't find it, and we also don't know what tribe we're from. And that's just the way he brought it.
I like that.
So, anyway.
Yeah, and that's helpful, but because especially the musical instrument argument, we get people who say, well, they did it in the Old Testament, and God obviously approved it, because he told them how to do it in some places. So it's like, what do you do with that? Well, same thing, God told them how to handle burning incense, or having the table of showbread in the temple, and the way that they were to offer animal sacrifices, he did all that. And he obviously approved of that worship. Do we say that we need to do all of that now? And that's the thing, understanding, and this, by the way, is one of the things, if you remember, that really took the Campbells and broke them separate from the Baptist church, because of things that they were saying about using the Old Testament law as authority. They said, no, we can't do that. And there's a difference, there's a distinction. And so we have passages that talk about the law that was nailed to the cross, and all of those sorts of things. And the book of Hebrews about trying to go back to we can't do that. So we have to understand where we get our authority from, and how do we know what we should be doing. And it's a hard discussion to have, but I think it's definitely necessary. Thank you. Just to make sure we get through this lesson, let's talk about some of the remaining things. There's just a couple things left in this one. Premillennialism And we discussed this a little bit before. Premillennialism, what does this have to deal with? Like, what is that? Just in general.
Millennials, 1,000 years, what has to do with the 1,000-year reign of Christ.
Yeah.
You're pre-millennials and post-millennials, and hard to know which millennial you're in, but it's all about 1,000 years that's taken out of context in Revelation and applied to today's world.
Yeah, there you go. And so it's views of end times. When God says, okay, it's enough, are we going to have Jesus coming and establishing a physical kingdom on the earth for 1,000 years before we have final judgment? Or is there like the tribulation period? Is this pre-tribulation, post-tribulation? There's all kinds of other nuances there as far as what the end times are going to be like. And this was an issue that was very divisive amongst churches in the early 1900s. And there was a lot of talk about that. Now, some of the reasons why this was such a big thing is because there was experience in the world, things that they hadn't seen before. World War I and World War II. Like, those were pretty big, massive things, and it makes you think, oh my goodness, like, what's going to happen? Like, if this is happening on a global scale, like, we've seen wars, but we haven't seen this. And, like, that got people thinking, and it renewed interest in some of, like, the end-time predictions and prophecies and that sort of thing. There was sort of a resurgence of that in the 1800s, but here this was like a fresh one. And this caused people to reevaluate some things. Honestly, most people that we've been talking about in the Restoration movement probably would hold to some sort of premillennial view. And that's what a lot of them probably, that's how they would be thinking. But it's through all this time period that they really like got into it, discussed it, and they had different camps, different viewpoints on this. And it got to the point where like just a lot of people in general would band together and be like, no, don't accept this, like keep that out. Now, here's a couple things to think about that. One. No. Yeah, okay, here we go. What if, we look at an issue like this. Should this be a divisive issue? When you think about it, what's the gospel say as far as how we are saved, how we become a Christian, how we have a relationship with God? So we have some very specific things that we need to do in order to have that relationship with God. If someone holds a view about end times that doesn't align with what everyone else thinks, and what we would see as the Bible teaching, what do we do with that? Because do we say, since you have that view, you're not a Christian? Yeah. Or, if you don't see things as I do, here's the problem. Once we start doing that, once we start saying, well, you're not a Christian if you hold to this, that is dangerous territory. Because you have group, and it's typically the people who are most, I don't want to say selective, but what do you call it when you, restrictive, that's the word. Groups like, and we discussed this a little bit, the preterist. You know what I mean by that, preterist? Realized eschatology, does that help? Yeah, no it doesn't. The 70 AD doctrine, because there is a movement within the Churches of Christ that say that all biblical prophecy was fulfilled in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem. And that group, they are very adamant in teaching that if you believe anything else, you are not a Christian. And that if you hold any other viewpoint, like, you're not. And, like, that really isolates them, right? And so we have to be careful when it comes to things like that. Now, we balance this out a little bit because, if we see, the biblical truth is this, then we do need to share that with people. And these are things discussions we can have. But is it something that we say, you are not a Christian because you believe that? Like that's, you think about 1 Corinthians 15. Do you remember what Paul was addressing there with the church at Corinth? What were some of them saying?
That was the meat.
No, that was 8. But Yeah, little, so 1 Corinthians 15, biggest chapter on the resurrection. Do you know what the problem was there in Corinth? He said, how is it that some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? And he was talking to a group of Christians. He was talking, and remember how he referred to those people. He referred to them as brethren, as a church. He didn't say that you're off on this view, so I don't look at you as, in the church. Now, he did make efforts to correct their thoughts, and he taught them, this is what's going to happen. But, again, the way he looked at that was a little different. So, I think we need to be cautious if someone has a different viewpoint, especially of things that are not directly related. I don't want to, myself, label things as salvation issues or not, because I'm not the one who makes those calls. That's God. But we know what the gospel says, and we know what has been revealed to us as how to become a Christian. But what do we do with these issues about end times? Do you know how many of the Jews, when all they had was the Old Testament, Jesus wasn't born yet? Do you know how many of them perfectly understood what Jesus coming would look like? Nobody. It was not what they expected at all. So, is it fair to say that there are things that we probably have no idea? And that's actually what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, right? He was like, some people say, what kind of body are we going to have? And what's that going to... And he's like, foolish mortals. I'm paraphrasing. But he was like, it's like, just trust it. God's going to take care of it. God can give a body to whoever he needs to give a body to. Like, he gives a body to the sun. He gives a body to, plants. So, don't you think he can take care of that? He knows. And that's the sort of thing that we need to trust in. That God is in control and he knows what's up, so we need to do our best to do that. Now, so here's the thing. When it comes to people who are teaching different things about this, I think there's a way that we can have good, productive conversations that don't devolve into name-calling and saying you're not a Christian. And so we have to be careful with how we approach that. And that's end times views. I would even say that also would apply to views of origins, because there are some major differences in opinion about that. Now, I do believe that we should be able to have those conversations without, vitriol, anger, whatever. But it seems like end times views and beginning times views, these are areas that we have strong viewpoints on. And we just got to be careful when someone else is saying, well, what about this? Don't automatically be like, ooh, no, get out. You can't. I'm not saying get out. The bell, that was just... But we got to be careful with how we approach those situations. That's all I'm trying to say there. And just, understand that people are in different places with this. Now, there was also the institutionalism thing. And there, at the very end, leaving such an easy topic to discuss for the end. Cool. I would say be cautious about how we look at the decisions people make. Think about this. What is our governing body as a church? We've said this in so many different ways. We're autonomous, right? And the elders make the decisions. Now, obviously, Christ is the head, and he is the ultimate. He makes this, but it's not that we have our group is connected to this group, who's connected to that group, who we make decisions so that everybody is on board, and all churches are teaching the same thing. No, each church is accountable to God. And think about this too. In the book of Revelation, in Revelation 2 and 3, Jesus is writing letters directly to those churches. There were some churches that he wrote a letter to that's basically man, y'all are bad. Figure it out. He wrote 2 letters to churches that they were doing really good. And he said, keep doing it. But the other 4, I think it was they were doing some good things, and there were some members who were doing really well, but then there were some that weren't either. So think about that. Is it possible that in a group where the truth is being taught, and things are going really well, and we're doing things the right way, is it possible that there are members of that group that aren't really Christians, that aren't really doing the right things, that 100%. Yeah. So, like, we have to keep in mind, we are judged individually. We are not judged based on the church that we're part of, right? Because Jesus still sees people in those churches that weren't doing, everything the right way, but that you're faithful. I see you, and I know where you stand, and I know what you're doing, and so, like, keep that in mind. So when it comes to that, and again, Jesus is talking to a group of people, those churches. He still calls them churches, and he says, he does warn that he's going to take their candlestick away, lampstand, not candlestick. It was close enough. But he does warn about that. But he's also saying, some of you are faithful, some aren't, and we gotta treat things like that. And we need to understand, just because we're part of a group doesn't mean that I'm okay. It's an individual relationship. I think we got to be cautious also with the way that we look at other groups. Because can we say that this other group, because they hold to premillennial views or whatever, can we say for a fact, okay, all of you are doomed? Like, no, I don't think we can say that. We have to be careful with our judgment and how we view people, how we talk to people. And really, ultimately, we know God is in charge. God is in control. And the answers to a lot of these questions, people ask, well, what about that person? What about this group? What about this? That's God's choice. That's not me. That's not. This is what I see the New Testament is teaching. And this is what I see as the truth. And that's what I want to do. And that's what I think you should do. But when it comes to it, it's not my call. Like, I'm not going to say if you are saved or not, because I can't do that. But I will show you what the Bible says. And, you take that. So, okay. There was a lot to say there and a lot that we discussed. Any thoughts or questions, comments on any of that?
I think that, for me personally, I kind of always hate when people are like, oh, where do you go to church at? Because as soon as I say Church of Christ, it's one of two things. Oh, you all don't believe in music, or you think you're the only ones going to heaven.
Right.
And I hate telling people where I go to church, because that's one of the two responses that I get 90% of the time.
Yeah.
And it
Which
just irks me to know it.
Which is why Meredith mentioned that earlier about the name thing. And I think sometimes things just automatically, assumptions are made. And so, like, we got to be aware of that, know that people are going to automatically think that about us, and make sure we're not doing that for other people too. But we understand that is a possibility, and we have to be ready for those conversations.
Right.
Yeah.
However, that also opens up the opportunity for a conversation to say, oh, no, we just don't believe in music, instrumental music being used in church. I listen to my radio, I have records, whatever. But that also opens up an opportunity for explanation or maybe a conversation.
Right. Exactly. And that's a good point too. Because and I think it'll become pretty obvious pretty quickly. If someone is willing to have a discussion and be open-minded and thoughtful, or if they're just looking for ways to throw you down. And especially, using the Campbellite name. That's a thing that we talked about a little bit before, but especially if they know history of what's going on, it's like, oh, well, you're just Campbellite, and that sort of thing. He taught some things that I would disagree with, but really when it comes down to it, the Bible is our source of authority, and that's really what I want to stand on. And so that's what our conversation should revolve around. That is a great point though, because automatically it's like, whoa, we can have those conversations because it's sort of built in. So that is a good point too. All right, we didn't get to this again yet, but we will, Lord willing, on Wednesday. If there's anything else you want to add to it, that would be cool. And we also are going to do just an overall review of literally the history of everything. So we'll talk about that too. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.